Want to hear from a man who took the risk of standing up for principle and changed the way that justice is administered in the state? Of course you do. Welcome to Northern Vibe. I'm Matthew Maloney, host and founder of Northern Vibe. Northern Vibe believes in cultivating curiosity, and tonight, I got to say, I am thrilled. I'm going to get all fanboy to be able to interview Terry O'Gorman. Although I got to say, being an ex-policeman, I do feel somewhat like Daniel walking into the lion's den, to be candid. Before I go into the interview, a big thanks to Mel Goll for your guidance and assistance, as well as Jabru, Topher McLaughlin, Stickman Steyer, Sonia, Janelle, Rebecca, and all the regulars. I really, really appreciate the feedback and guidance that you guys are giving me, and it's really helping Northern Vibe. Now, my guest's really quick biography for those very few Queenslanders who haven't heard of him. He was raised in Brisbane and is one of 15 kids raised in an Irish Catholic family. I got to say that warms my heart, which includes 2 coppers, another lawyer, and 3 nuns. Now, as a student during the Bjelke-Petersen years, he became inspired to work in the area of civil rights and spent many years with the Aboriginal Legal Aid Foundation, where he actually cross-examined he's no longer the former Premier, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, during the Fitzgerald enquiry. He was president of the Queensland Council of Civil Liberties from 1979 to 1985, and again from 1990 to 1994. At the same time, his brother, John Bluey O'Gorman, was actually the president of the police union. So I'm going to say it would have been some pretty interesting Christmas table discussions, I would imagine. And coming from an Irish Catholic family myself, I kind of get it. Mr. O'Gorman, thank you very much for coming, and welcome to Northern Vibe.
Thanks, mate. Call me Terry.
Oh, thank you. It's just my dad who does listen. He's kind of big on titles. So, Dad, doing what you told me to do. Look, we're just going to dive right into it, Terry, if that's okay. Look, I'll just get you to tell me a little bit about yourself. Like, I gave the basic bits of background, but tell us about you.
Well, as you indicated in the intro, I come from a family of 15 children. I went to school and was captain of St Patrick's College at Shorncliffe, where Tony Fitzgerald, who wrote the landmark anti-corruption report, went to school some years before me. I left school having completed grade 12 in 1968, got a Commonwealth scholarship, went to university to study law, and the first experience that I had of the disconnect between the way I was being taught law, particularly criminal law at university, and criminal law, the way it works on the street, was the Springbok state of emergency that occurred in 1971. We are now close to the 50th anniversary of that Springbok state of emergency. What happened there was the racially selected Springbok rugby union team from, of course, South Africa came to Australia. They had a couple of major games in southern capitals and were met with significant protest because of the fact that only whites were allowed play for the Springboks. Apartheid was at that time a very controversial government and regime in South Africa. Joh Bjelke-Petersen, who had only a short 12 months or so beforehand became Premier, saw the law and order value in declaring the state of emergency. He had a important by-election coming up for one of the inner Brisbane city seats of the state parliament. He declared a state of emergency. Numerous police were brought in, including police from the country. Ray Whitwad was the then police commissioner. He had been brought in, the first non-Queenslander to be a police commissioner, I think, in Queensland police history. He had shaken up the police force considerably. He was getting a lot of opposition from the union. So when the state of emergency was declared, the RNA ground where the ECA is held each August was the area where the game was to be played. Numerous police barbed wire were constructed, and that was where the game was played. It was an eye-opener for me because the way I saw a democracy working was not to declare a state of emergency and bring in hundreds of police from outside the capital, just simply to allow a football game to be played.
Yeah, exactly. And look, in my mind, that unleashes so many kind of questions. And I don't know if you saw the film Invictus, where after Mandela goes to back the Springboks when they were playing New Zealand, the All Blacks. That really famous film. And before that, ironically, because of the foolishness of apartheid, this idea of selecting people on the base of race is just ridiculous. It was actually seen as a white people sport. And now I read a Spectator article just from this week's Spectator indicating just how ridiculously popular rugby union is in South Africa over there now, and disproportionately with the I don't know what correct word I can use without getting in trouble, the non-white South African population. So it's kind of great to see this world sport that's come leaps and bounds, and people were sticking up for those things way back then. I remember seeing that on TV, and I was really young. I don't know if it was like just replays I saw a little bit later, but I remember that. And I also remember too, because back then the police uniforms were, the country coppers had brown shirts, or the kind of khaki shirts. And I remember people chanting stuff brown, about the brown shirts, and obviously making analogies with Hitler's brown shirts back then, and telling him to go home, and these scared looking country coppers. Anyway, but no, look, that was if you could tell us about the distinction, because I'm a great believer, just to give you some very quick background and to give the listeners some very quick background. I've just come out of the Queensland Police Service. Actually, it was my last day 6 days ago, 30 years. But I'm a great believer, like you, in law and order. And I believe in our adversarial system. As to paraphrase Churchill, it's the worst system invented and put into practice, except of course for every other system ever practiced by humankind. The adversarial, British justice works kind of well. And there's always a problem when you get a gap between the principles and the practice. Are you in a position to make a comment of just how big the gap back then was between the principles and the practice?
Well, to answer that question, I'd add in the events of 1975 to 1977. In 1976, a hippie commune at Cedar Bay was raided by Queensland Police, and believe it or not, Federal Customs gunboats. It was a raid supposedly looking for drugs. What they found was some hippies, unsurprisingly, having some personal cannabis. And on the way out, some of the raiding police burnt some of the dwellings down. Some police in Cairns were charged with that. They were acquitted by a jury. Then a short time after that, there was a major university demonstration going on in Brisbane over the perennial issue of student fees and student allowances. A inspector was seen and was filmed hitting a very slight female student over the head with a baton. The then Chancellor or Vice Chancellor of Queensland University, Sir Zalman Cowan, who went on to become Governor General of Australia, called for an independent inquiry. Joh Bjelke-Petersen said that there would be no inquiry. Then in 1976-77, two major events happened. One was there was an inquiry into the enforcement of criminal law in Queensland. It was headed by Supreme Court Judge George Lucas. It had on it two other people, recently retired Superintendent of Police and a then prominent defence lawyer, Des Sturgis. One of the main things that came out of that was a very strong recommendation that police interviews of suspects be tape recorded. That was at a time when I had just started the Aboriginal Legal Service in January 76. My training as a lawyer had been in commercial firms. I had done no crime. and within a very short time, I became aware of a significant minority of police. I use that phrase deliberately and fairly to the majority, but a significant minority of police were engaged in bashing Aboriginal suspects, verbaling them, that is, saying that they had confessed to crimes when they had not. The police had just, the offending police, the significant minority, just simply typed up interviews and then said at the end, do you want to sign this? The suspect would say, no, I don't say anything. The suspect would then say to the lawyers, I didn't make those admissions at all. The inquiry looked at this then rife system of Queensland verbaling, and verbaling was quite serious because not only were this significant minority of police just simply making up confessions, they were then going into court, lying under oath about it, and people were being jailed on the basis of these made-up confessions. So the Lucas inquiry recommended mandatory tape recording of police interviews. The police union of the day objected to it. Joe Bjelke-Petersen and several of the police union object to it. It won't happen. And it only was brought in late 1989 at the very end of the Fitzgerald inquiry, which had heard the same evidence that had been heard 12 years earlier in the 1977 inquiry about significant minority of police lying and verbaling. And as history would show, my brother Frank, who was then Assistant Police Commissioner, in fact was given the task of bringing in mandatory tape recording. So you've got that history to look at to answer your question as to the disconnect between the theory and the practice up until police were mandated to tape record interviews with suspects. The gap between what the police did and what they lied about in court. When I say police, I mean significant minority, not all, was huge. The Fitzgerald inquiry, with the tape recorded recommendations, with the other changes, has made a significant difference to the practice of police verbaling. Now, many police in 2021 recognise the value of tape recording from point of first contact when they go out to speak to or arrest someone. The sensible police, the straight police, now tape record from point of first contact for two reasons. It enables them to protect themselves against a false allegation that they have bashed someone or that they are making up a confession that occurred before the person got to the police station. Sensible police know that if they tape record from point of first contact, it's on the tape what they say, it's on the tape what the suspect says. So things are much better now than they were in the 70s and 80s, although there's still considerable room for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's always room for improvement. But look, I'm going to ask a loaded question, and remembering that I'm out of the job now, so you can be as candid as you like. How professional do you see the Queensland Police Service now, generally speaking?
I see it as being incredibly better than the 70s and the 80s. The main drawback is that minority of police that throughout history, not just in this country, but in the UK, Canada, US, similar systems of law and justice to ours, the minority that continue to break the law still have not been brought properly to account. There is still the system of police investigating police, despite the establishment of the Criminal Justice Commission as a result of the Fitzgerald inquiry that handed down its decision or its report in early 1990, despite the recommendations that the Criminal Justice Commission, now the Crime and Corruption Commission, look into all complaints against police. In the mid-90s, under Beattie, that was significantly changed, and just about all complaints against police now, except for complaints of corruption and the like, are handed back to the police to investigate. So it's police investigating police again. That carries with it the lack of credibility, the preparedness of complainants, particularly from the disadvantaged sector of society, particularly Aboriginal complainants and poor white complainants, who say, what's the point of complaining about police if police are still investigating police? Until we get back to the immediate work that the Criminal Justice Commission had, where Fitzgerald said that all complaints against police are to be investigated by the now Crime and Corruption Commission. And can I make it clear, that's what happens in New South Wales in 2021. All complaints against police are investigated by an independent body. Until that is done in Queensland, we still have not fixed up properly or remedied the verballing, the unaccountable assaults and bashings that were rife in the 70s and 80s. They're not rife now, but they still occur. Until such time as an independent body, completely separate from the police, investigate police, the problem remains unsolved.
Mm. I agree, Mace. I agree mainly. The only qualification that I make, and we agree in substance, is having been, like, I finished up as a sergeant, so a lot of my day-to-day duties, in fact, the disproportionate amount of my day-to-day duties was supervision, and for your kind of petty stuff where, oh, he swore at me, or he gave me a ticket when I shouldn't have, or you know, he said these, he searched my bag when he shouldn't have. I get that needs to be looked after, because the police really do have a high amount of trust. We work on trust, and something that I always found very, very reassuring was that people kind of trust us. In fact, when people would come to the front counter and say, look, I want to complain about the police, the first thing I would do, Terry, would say, look, I got to thank you for coming into the police station to talk to me. And 8 times out of 10, not all the time, 8 times out of 10, you get these people do this Kramer-esque double take and go, like, why? And I go, because it implies you trust us. Like, the underlying, you wouldn't have come here if you thought that it was completely and utterly without point. And you could see people go, yeah. So when I was disciplining, you know, my constables or senior connies for stuff like, or I was getting disciplined too, because, like, I'm a human being. Like, I've got failings. Like, you know, without going precisely to what I've done, like, I've failed to meet the mark at times, and I've needed discipline myself, even late in my career. You know, we're all human. Night work, you're tired, whatever it is. But they kind of want to be spoken to by someone who's been there. So having a sergeant who's kind of like, mate, someone in uniform saying, I have been where you have been, and I've done it for a lot longer than you have done, and what you did is totally unacceptable, and you're going to answer to me, and our culture. Because one of the other things that Fitzgerald talked about was culture. So if you have a healthy culture, and quite clearly, you know, the culture that you were talking about, and you're right, if you do get a significant minority, like, it kind of, you really only need about 5%, a little bit over 5%, I think. And things are starting to go. Things are starting, you know, things like, oh, I don't know, who's running the show, who's scared of who? Because the corrupt police or criminality generally, criminals need to be scared of authority, not authority of criminality. People in the dark and shadows need to be in the dark and shadows. They need to be scared of the good guys, and the good guys need to be in the majority. Does that kind of make sense?
Well, it does. A common element to the police force that Fitzgerald reported on and the police force of today is the central aspect of supervision at sergeant level. The reason why there was corruption in the licensing branch that Fitzgerald exposed was the total lack of supervision. Fitzgerald noted that in relation to complaints against police, that there are patterns, that if there's proper supervision, those patterns will become obvious, so that if, say, an Aboriginal community in a particular country town are constantly making complaints about the same 2 or 3 police, those patterns have to be identified and recognised and acted on. Fitzgerald found that the lack of supervision at sergeant level was the main cause the main cause of police misbehaviour, including the corruption that he found primarily in the licensing branch. And it is my experience, and even though I've been out of Aboriginal legal aid now for many years, my colleagues who still work there say that it is the lack of supervision, the lack of bringing to account that significant minority of errant police who just simply think they can get away with it and do get away with it, that causes the current problems. If there was much more conscientious supervision at sergeant level, including sergeants getting out on the street at night, watching what their officers do, calling them to account if excessive force is used, then the problems that currently exist in policing in Queensland, particularly with minority groups, can be reduced. Because you are absolutely right. Police in Queensland, police in any state or territory in Australia can only do their job if the community they police trust them.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I was in America for a little while doing some research, some study over there, and I nearly fell off my chair, Terry. Like, this was in 2015, and there are a couple of jurisdictions that were just starting to introduce tape recording, like brand new. And I was sitting there at one of the briefings, because they do. It's kind of like most of the, especially the bigger services, or well, forces over there, they have like the muster. It's like TV. You'll get the shift supervisor, the sergeant, or the lieutenant, they call them, walk in. Okay, guys, Smith Jones, you're working this area, you're doing this, you're doing this. These are the issues going on. I've got to digress for just a second. In Maui, where I was talking about, they're having a massive problem with chicken fighting, because they've got all these. I'm not making this up, okay? I'm not making this up, because there's a big Asian community over there, and they love their cockfighting. They absolutely loved it. So they were like dedicating a couple of cops to go chase up these fighting chickens. I just loved it. I'm like, things aren't so bad. Things aren't so bad in Maui when like your big problem is chickens that are fighting each other. But they were like, we have to start recording stuff. And I'm like, we've been doing it pretty much since I was sworn in. Like, it was just starting to be introduced when I was sworn in 91. The rollout had, the agreement had happened, but the rollout was still occurring, and the issue was who's going to pay for the recordings and all this kind of stuff. And some of the guys were like, "Well, how do you function?" And I go, "It's the best thing that's ever happened. It is the best thing that's ever happened, for precisely the reasons that you discussed before. But the simple fact is, when there's a recorder running, even better, camera, because we got the cameras now. They're the best thing since sliced bread. Said first they moderate you, second they moderate your staff, but third, when people see they're being recorded as well, they kind of like, and you can see them, like they'll look at it, and they'll change their behavior. Supervision, as you've indicated, like the idea of being watched changes human behavior. It's that simple. So I just don't understand why there was this issue with, and there still is, Terry. Like even in decent Anglosphere jurisdictions in America today, like they are. Some of them, don't get me wrong, and the vast majority, I need to make this because I know that some of my American colleagues are actually going to see this. So, I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything particularly untoward. I didn't see any corruption. I didn't see any, uses of forces that I thought were unlawful. But the idea that they're not recording stuff, and the idea that we're looking up to these jurisdictions when it kind of should be the other way around. It's like, guys, you're in the dark ages. Like, notebooks, really? Like who uses them? But I really want to. There's so many things that I want to pick your brains about. Now, really quickly for some of our listeners, and g'day to Les, g'day to Sharpie, and g'day to Youngie, and I haven't got all the other names of people out there. But if anyone's got any questions for Terry, don't hesitate to put them up there, or want to make any comments. Would really love to hear your comments, and really, if you've got any questions that you want me to ask Terry, put them up. But for the non-lawyers and non-coppers out there, I really don't think most people understand the apparently schizophrenic nature of our adversarial legal system. And when people think of rule of law, they just think of authority protecting them from criminals, which is not unreasonable. Like in a kind of semi-decent society. Well, in any decent society, that's where you haven't got a corrupt, malignant, malevolent government, that's kind of the way it's going to be. And we've got all these organisations up here now that are really big on law and order. But I'd really like your comment on the importance of laws protecting the public from government and arbitrary use of authority, and how they're kind of complementary, because there's this idea that, lawyers like you are the bad guys, when that's not the way that I and I'm not saying this to be polite, like, that's not the way I see things. I did, admittedly, foolishly in the first 5 years of my career, but then I started to understand the power of the adversarial system and the different types of law that we're being protected from. Can you kind of discuss that and just really briefly explain it for lay people and how these things are complementary rather than...
Well, the way the adversarial system works is the police arrest, the police gather the evidence, the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecution's Office, in front of juries prosecute, police prosecutors prosecute in the lower court. The standard that the prosecution have to reach is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high standard, but it's not an impossible standard. Statistics tend to show that the rate of convictions of contested jury trials is in the vicinity of 60%. It's 95% in Japan. It's 99.9% in China. You look at the Chinese system, compare it with our system is much better. And the reason why you have an adversarial system is when a person is convicted, particularly of a serious offence, they go to jail. Jail deprives you of your liberty. Jail often causes huge problems with your family because you're not there. And one of the interesting things I found, particularly in the prosecutions that were brought during the 90s in the lead up to Fitzgerald and after Fitzgerald, was that police would come to me, to my firm, to John Robertson, who's the part of Robertson O'Gorman, and would seek representation because they knew that we took a thorough approach. They knew that we took the position that we were there to defend, and we were there to defend seriously and put the prosecution to proof. Some lawyers think that it's okay just to go through the motions. It's not. The fact is that police, the Queensland Police Service in this state now has a budget of well over $2.5 billion. There are in excess of 11 to 12,000 sworn police. It is critical that if the system is to be fair, that convictions are obtained on evidence that is transparent, and convictions are obtained fairly by prosecutors who are obliged to fight hard but fight fair. And frankly, with some criticisms, I think our system works mostly well, not all the time, but it works well most of the time.
Absolutely. I concur with that. Like, as human beings, like we tend to, it's just a psychological thing. We tend to look for the worst things to fix up. And unfortunately, we end up describing and defining systems by their weaknesses rather than the strengths. So look, it's understandable. Like you might see something in the papers like, apparently guilty person walks free, or, vice versa. Apparent injustice done by authorities still results in some sort of terrible conviction. I just don't think it's fair or accurate to define our system by those things. I mean, yes, they do happen. Yes, there are injustices, but outside of heaven, where are you going to get perfect justice? And I explain this, and I'd explain this to my young constables, and I explain it to really pro law and order people who just kind of want to talk to you because you're in the police and they think that you want everyone locked up. And I'd end up having to really put people in and going, look, you don't get it. The rule of law works both ways. Yes, like we need the community to be able to, so if you forget to lock your front door, it's not catastrophic. You can walk down the street safely. you can do these things. But you also, the community needs to be free from the arbitrary use of authority so that they can live in their homes safely. Like in China, people really, I got Chinese friends, and they would tell me that people disappear in the night. Like that happens. You know, the authorities kind of don't like you. They don't obey the rule of law. They want to impose the law about, oh, you've been a criminal, you've done this, but they don't want to obey the laws like, okay, well, you got to remember that people have got the right to remain silent. You can't hit people. You can't do these. There are laws that the police must obey and the authorities must obey as well. And they protect you from that mostly well-meaning, I would say, in the Anglosphere. It's not true in other places. That well-meaning, overzealous authority. So that's just as bad. Now, we've had this fantastic conversation about the history, and I think it's given us some really good context. Can you start talking now? Yeah, sorry, no, Les. I'm not going to be a Dutch painter despite the shirt. Just one of the chaps is knocking my shirt. Mate, can you talk about what you threat, and because everyone, when we talk about civil libertarians, we always talk about the police. That's kind of understandable. But can you talk about other bodies and other concerns that you have? And I also want to lead into technology, how that has changed the dynamic between government and citizens. So if we can kind of talk about other bodies other than the police and the relationship, they're enforcing these other laws, from anything like cutting down trees to speech to whatever it is that concerns you and things that we need to kind of be careful about.
I think the growing rise of surveillance, particularly by large companies such as Google and Facebook, is something that is now starting to gain some public traction. Most of your viewers would know that every time you use a mobile phone, every time you use a laptop, every time you use an iPad, Google, Facebook mines your data. They do it so that they can then get a profile of you and sell your data to advertisers and make a lot of money in so doing. 10, 15 years ago, when civil libertarians started to say, well, hang on, there are some significant privacy issues here. Most people would say, oh, you're just making a mountain out of a molehill. I recently read a survey done by the Australian Human Rights Commission that put out a report on CCTV and particularly facial recognition, that said that a recent, quite credible poll found that over 60% of Australians now are concerned about their privacy, are concerned just as much about private companies such as Facebook and Google and what they can do to misuse your data, and the ease with which government agencies can go into Google and Facebook, often without a warrant, and get your data. So that there's now a significant shift in public opinion in this country from 10 or 15 years ago, where maybe 10% would be concerned about the privacy implications of unregulated companies like Google and Facebook, to this more recent poll that says 60% plus of Australians are becoming increasingly worried about the lack of privacy, the privacy that they have to surrender, the lack of control they have over the data that they have to, in effect, sign up to in order to be able to use their mobile phone, their laptop, their iPad, and in order to be able to access Google and Facebook's products.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I've got a question I want to ask, but I've got to be very careful with wording it, because I'm not allowed to comment about any issues of state policy, and I would never presume to do that. And nor am I allowed to criticise any institutions. So I can't and I won't do that. But each institution has a culture, like Fitzgerald talked about the police culture and stuff like that. Now, there are many of these quasi-law enforcement authorities, like the Human Rights Commission and stuff like that, that have cultures within them. Now, in your experience, are those cultures kind of like, do those cultures respect the traditions, the traditions of how law enforcement as we know it, the adversarial system, the idea of the sovereign individual, the idea of not taking into account power dynamics, critical race theory, things like that. Are those, in your experience, are those organisations, do you have any concerns in regards to the culture and the ideological leanings of any of those organisations?
I don't have concerns about organisations such as the Australian Human Rights Commission. I think that they have tried over time to raise for public discussion important human rights issues. I think, however, the direction in which discrimination laws around the country are going does pose something of a worry. I think the necessity to maintain freedom of speech, even if you end up insulting someone, is paramount. I think what we're seeing happen, and we're seeing it happen on the left as well as on the right of Australian politics, is an increasing intolerance to criticism of views that might be held by some people on the left or by some people on the right, an increasing use of anti-discrimination law to shut down legitimate protest. We had the university student last year at the University of Queensland who had to bring an action in the courts because he argued, and successfully argued, that his freedom of speech was being impinged upon because he took the view that on the campus of the University of Queensland there are a lot of Chinese students who are allied with the communist government in China and who were in fact spying on other students. Now, I think it's critical that people be able to say that. I think it's critical that people be able to express their views on any topic, be it gay marriage, be it freedom of religion, in the most strident of terms, so long as they don't threaten violence. Freedom of speech has, in my view, in effect got to be almost absolute with a couple of qualifications. You shouldn't be allowed to incite violence. And of course, defamation laws are there to protect people who say that their reputations have been destroyed, say, by the media. So to answer your questions, it's important whenever you set up a new body to ensure that that new body over time still acts in accordance with basic civil liberties principles. Crime and corruption commissions or crime commissions around the country, they are subject to criticisms from time to time that they get too preoccupied with their super police force role and don't give enough credibility or don't put in enough work to the human rights implications of what they're doing. So my response to your question is, whether it's the Australian Human Rights Commission, whether it's a state-based crime commission, whether it's the long-argued Federal Integrity Commission that people have been saying should exist at federal level, every time you introduce a new body, you must have a control mechanism built in to ensure that they don't start to get out of control, that they don't start to create their own problems.
Exactly, and you kind of you see that in a lot of because I can obviously talk about a general debate about free speech generally, but you kind of see this now from the, and I don't have your degree of expertise, but from the limited reading that I've done, and from speaking to a couple of people that I know a couple of people that are involved in a couple of these organisations, there's a high degree of zealousness. Now it's not a bad thing. It's like, Matt, are you telling me that people should be able to discriminate? Are you pro hate? Are you pro these things? And of course that, I find those almost personal attacks, those ad hominem attacks, kind of tiresome and trite. But being an ex-cop, I get it. Like, if you think that this mission is so important, you're like, those rules don't count. And I I am, and I suppose I can talk about federal stuff as opposed to state. So I can criticise, federal government institutions and federal government policy and stuff like that without state. I can discuss them openly rather than criticise. But I am concerned, and there seems to be an erosion of these basic rights. Like, no, you do have the right to remain silent. So even if someone has accused you of racism, which is something that we all agree is bad, but you shouldn't be compelled to speak. You should be able to get legal representation. When you're fronting one of these, when you're fronting one of these organisations. I've got to be honest, it kind of concerns me, and it's funny it's funny that. So if you're being interviewed for something that's like really, really, really serious, that you can show that this person's life was destroyed by this murderer or by this sex offender or by this housebreaking or whatever it is. Whereas you kind of had these communal damages that are harder to define, and you can't even always point to an individual. It's like it's not even the crown as the victim. It's like the people, the community is the victim. I get really concerned about that. Like if you can't prove a harm to an individual, I genuinely worry about that, Terry. I really do. And like I'm pro law and order. I take that as read.
Part of the problem is best illustrated by what happened to Jack DeBellin, the rugby league footballer. He got accused of rape 2.5 years ago. The National Rugby League had brought in at that time a new rule, which civil libertarians opposed, saying that if footballers were charged with any form of sexual assault, they would be stood down while the case wended its way through the court. DeBellin had 2 trials. Both of them, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, or I think on the second one, the jury reached a verdict of not guilty on some and couldn't reach a verdict on others. And the DPP, after 2.5 years, dropped the charges against DeBellin. I was very critical in my civil liberties capacity of the National Rugby League policy that said DeBellin, who had the presumption of innocence, who has now not been convicted of anything, had to be suspended and could not play for 2.5 years in his chosen profession. He lost some of the best years of his playing life, and it is that sort of excessive application of rules that junk the presumption of innocence that concerns me as a civil libertarian. There are some on the left who are now becoming increasingly intolerant of certain aspects of free speech that they don't like. Equally, there are some on the right who are the same. There's calls for more and more speech to be banned. The issue of should a person have a right to fly the German Nazi swastika flag. However distasteful it is, I take the view that that is a part of freedom of speech. If you ban the swastika, do you ban the hammer and sickle? Yeah. Do you then ban the flag of North Korea? Do you then ban the flag of some other country you don't like? The incursions into freedom of speech by people who say, no, you shouldn't be allowed to say that, is for me as a civil libertarian a great worry. And I've got to say, some of that threat comes as much from the left as it does from the right.
Look, I couldn't agree more. I'd really like your take on Israel Folau.
Well, Israel Folau, in my view, has the right to be an idiot. He should not have been proceeded against by the Australian Rugby Union for his comments. Some viewed his comments as homophobic. Others viewed his comments as him simply reflecting his religious belief. And I think that what happened to Folau, I personally happen to think that what Folau preaches via his religious beliefs is just rubbish. But people are entitled to talk rubbish. He should not have had to experience what he experienced.
Yeah, precisely. I got to say, and that's it. Like everybody, it's really funny. Like when I talk to people as a now former law enforcement officer, there's always this assumption that I'm going to be on the side of authority, and I'm on the side of legitimate authority. You know, I am, but you know, there are times that you got to really keep an eye on authority because sometimes it does become illegitimate. And you've raised all of these places where it can kind of happen, where you get these quasi-judicial, like these, where they kind of want the legitimacy of the adversarial system with its due process and everything else, and its robes and its long history, dating back to Magna Carta and before. But they don't actually obey the rules that give that legitimacy. You know, and you do have some funny things happening at work, you know, some of the things that you hear about these work tribunals and things that some of the trumped up charges that people allegedly get dragged in before is, you know, pretty kind of concerning. But look, you spoke before about surveillance, and I don't know how much of an expert you are on the actual electronic side of things. Me personally, I kind of know almost nothing, but I've got an interview coming up with Dr. Paula Boddington in the UK in the next few weeks. And she holds a doctorate in philosophy, writes widely on ethics, and she has some really interesting takes on how technology itself, affects human reasoning, and more importantly, expectation at an individual and a social level. Can you talk about where you think this surveillance society is going? Positive and the negative, and if you think it's going to end well, and are there rules that we can put in place to sort of ensure things are good? And I've just had an interesting comment from Les Sharp, who've made the observation that freedom of speech doesn't come without consequences. Absolutely. Like, I don't think, you know, to quote that American High Court judge, I don't think you should be able to scream fire in a crowded cinema when there isn't there. But one of the other things is, Les and other listeners, is we always think when we're talking about curtailing, when we're talking about how we're going to manage these issues, we always think criminal. It's like, okay, well, let's criminalise this behaviour. We forget civil law. And the great thing about the common law and the civil law, and Terry may or may not back me up on this, but I suspect he will, is that it's a lot more flexible than criminal law. And you have to prove, like, this harm was caused by this person to this person. I think we neglect civil law way too much when it comes to resolving these disputes, and we criminalise way too much too early. But that's a good point, Les. But yeah, Terry, if you wouldn't mind, like, if you got any comments you want to make about that, fine, but as well. But like the the surveillance state thing, I find that concerning.
Well, the surveillance state, particularly as reflected in that recent poll that the Australian Human Rights Commission conducted, the surveillance state now has more people worried about where it's heading than was the case, say, 10 or 15 years ago. For instance, the concept of facial recognition technology now being installed into CCTVs that just litter our streets, CCTV cameras. The fact is, in some parts of the world, including some US states and some of the police forces in the UK, because the UK has a large number of smaller police forces, as does the US, is that some of those police forces have banned facial recognition until the problems of wrong identification are fixed up. What we tend and have tended to do until recently in this country is to unthinkingly accept every extra piece of surveillance that is exercised upon us as we walk about the public square. Most people don't realise that as they walk from A to B, that every step is captured by CCTV. Some people would say, well, I've got nothing to hide, therefore I don't care. Other people would agree with Sir Zelman Cowen when he was Governor General of this country many decades ago, that the right to privacy means the right to be left alone. Now, in 2021, we're starting to see an uptick in the number of people who are saying, well, hang on, surveillance is increasing at a great rate, both by private companies and by governments. That's because technology is increasing at a great rate and the law can't keep up with it. What we in the civil liberties movement say in this country is that we have very few controls over surveillance to ensure it doesn't go too far, whereas the UK has in effect a special body called a surveillance commissioner that ensures that every new law that is brought in that might increase surveillance in public places has some sort of a check and balance put in it, so that if greater surveillance occurs, say by way of more and more facial recognition technology being installed into street CCTVs, they ensure that the facial recognition technology is accurate. As I've said, a number of police services in the UK and the US have banned them in the last 12 months until the false positives, that is, people being wrongly picked out as their facial features lining up with a particular mugshot that the police have, and it turns out to be wrong. That's happening more and more. And I think people in our society are now starting to say, well, we welcome increased technology, but we've got to control the technology, not the technology control us.
And that's exactly it. And Dr. Boddington and I are going to have a very interesting conversation around that, because if you think what human beings, understandably, what we want to do is get rid of mistakes. It's like, okay, well, we all recognise this is an important issue. We got to get rid of that. We've got to get rid of the mistakes. And we've got this idea that technology is truly impartial. Well, algorithms are not impartial. They're just not. Because they're made by humans and there's a certain amount of bias and there's all these kind of other things that go in. They will do what they're programmed to do without fail. But the issue is, what are they programmed to do? What are they looking for? And you do get, as you indicated, you do get the false positive. So yeah, that's you know, I really couldn't agree more with you on that one. There is something I kind of I do want to touch on as well. And before I say what it is, I got to say what it isn't, because I'm pretty sure my cousin is watching, and he's head of the vaccination rollouts down south, and I'm going to get vaccinated. I think COVID is a serious disease, all those necessary qualifications, mate. But I actually see now on Facebook sites, there are discussions to make vaccination and these medical treatments compulsory. So taking away the choice. And again, and the argument is the same with well, pretty much anything else. It's like, well, these people have the potential to do great harm in society. We have to take their, their freedom to choose away. What's your take on like the idea of either mandatory or well, first I'll ask a clear question on mandatory like vaccinations. Like, what would be your take on something like that?
Well, I don't think any government, let alone a government in a democracy, should forcibly vaccinate someone who doesn't want to be vaccinated. On the other hand, we need to look at what has been going on in kindergartens now for decades. If you don't vaccinate your child against smallpox, measles, and other transmissible diseases that children get, then you can't enrol your child in the kindergarten. And it's the greater good argument. That same argument can apply to the vaccination debate about whether people should or should not be unable to access certain services if they're not vaccinated. For instance, Joyce, the head of Qantas 12 months ago, said that Qantas is seriously looking at not allowing people to travel, particularly overseas on Qantas planes, unless they're vaccinated. I had some unease about that. I still do. But on the other hand, you've got to balance the right of people to travel and not to get COVID from people in planes who are not vaccinated. You've got to balance that. And I fall with some reluctance on the side of, well, it is in the greater good for everyone to get vaccinated if you have a strong view about vaccination, and that means, that is, a strong view against vaccination, and that means that you can't access certain cinemas, certain shops, because cinemas and shops say only people who are vaccinated after a period of time can enter, then that's the consequence. The other point I'd make about COVID is this. In this country, particularly in Queensland, we have not done what the New Zealanders have done and set up a special full-time parliamentary committee to examine every 6 months how the COVID powers are being used, to call for submissions about abuse of COVID powers. The COVID powers have now been in existence for almost 18 months. They have largely been accepted, but increasing numbers of people are saying we resent lockdowns, that the lockdowns should not be as frequent as they are. There are legitimate voices on both sides of that debate. I happen to fall on the side of lockdown early and lockdown hard, because the evidence to me seems to indicate that if you do that, you can suppress an outbreak quickly. But I understand, even though I don't agree with, I understand those who take the opposite point of view, the so-called anti-vaxxers, and they should be allowed their freedom of speech to give their anti-vaccination message.
Absolutely, and I agree with their freedom of speech. But Terry, as a civil libertarian, is it kind of okay to exclude people from society?
Well, you've got to weigh, particularly in relation to pandemic, you've got to weigh the medical consequences versus the civil liberties consequences. Nowhere in life would any civil libertarian, include me, say that a right is absolute. A right is always subject to qualifications. And if a government says, well, you haven't been vaccinated, therefore you should have certain restrictions put on you in terms of how you use public transport. You should, for instance, be required to wear a mask if you refuse to be vaccinated. I think that's a discussion that's got to be had, because some people are forced to use public transport. Much public transport is hugely overcrowded in peak hour. If you have a respiratory problem, not necessarily because you're old, but if you have a respiratory problem or other medical problem that causes you to be at higher risk of catching COVID, particularly in public transport, you're entitled to say, I'm entitled to travel with the maximum possible protections put in place. And if the protection is going to be that if you refuse to be vaccinated, then you must, even during non-periods of high infection, that you must be required to wear a mask, or that you must be required to stand in a part of a carriage where you're not at risk of infecting someone else, that debate's got to be held. Where the line is drawn is yet to be seen.
Yeah. It's interesting how it comes up in the conversation all the time that we need to debate and discuss the matter. And I think it's strange how freedom of speech has come up in this conversation quite a few times, because in my mind, I think that that's the most valuable right that we have. Because unless you can openly debate anything, and I mean anything, especially in Parliament, obviously, like, you know, they need unfettered kind of freedom of speech there. But unless we can openly debate these things and the methods that we're with discussing them, so, you know, you're not being shut down by Facebook, or you're not being shut down by these other things because they kind of don't like your worldview, or they think you're not left of centre enough, or they think you're, you know, it kind of concerns me.
Well, can I say that the shutting down of Donald Trump by Facebook greatly worried me because
Yeah.
I couldn't agree if Donald Trump addressed me by my right name. The reality, however, is that he has an entitlement to his views, so long as he is not actively inciting violence. His views have as much right to be on Facebook as those who have polar opposite views. Yes, Facebook have said that they've set up this super jury concept of leading figures from around the world that decide whether, for instance, Trump should be readmitted to Facebook. I still have significant concerns that he was kicked off because he has his right to freedom of speech, even though I personally cannot agree with the word that comes out of his mouth. The fact that I don't agree with it shouldn't be the yardstick. He should have the right to say whatever he wants to say, so long as he is not inciting violence. If he wants to carry on with this nonsense that the election was stolen and was full of fraud when there's not one iota of it, well, let him carry on with it. And I dare say most people in time who at least want to maintain an open mind will see it for the nonsense that it is. If you prevent a person with nonsense views from expressing them publicly, they'll go underground, they'll form a martyr base, and it is much less helpful to have that happen than to have freedom of speech that you don't agree with.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of comments coming up, and Emma Lang has said, "G'day, Emma," has said, "I agree. People do have the right to say what they believe. It leads to open discussions to see others' points of view, and that's how we're able to fix problems. Absolutely, freedom of speech is the mechanism that we use. As we can fix that, we're able to fix the problems. As we can't fix what we don't understand, but that needs to apply that needs to apply to all, not just to what's politically correct or to what's one side of the argument." And Sharpie, Les has made, Les, we all know your feelings about the former president. And he does make a point, though, that the allegation was raised that he was actually inciting violence around the Capitol Hill attack. I didn't follow American politics that closely. I actually simply can't comment on that. Look, I know everyone was like really watching Trump. I kind of just wasn't that interested in him. I know that makes me a political pariah, but I didn't find him that interesting. Look, I'm going to go right out on a limb here. We both come from Irish Catholic backgrounds, and most viewers now know I'm actually still a believer. That's neither here nor there. I raise this because I genuinely am starting to wonder now, and I think about this deeply, and I'm reading and I'm listening to a lot about it. I genuinely wonder if we can have a democracy without Judeo-Christian values. And I don't mean, and I do recognize, of course, there's a lot of Greek thought in Western history, and I get all that. So I suppose we could kind of lump those values in with Western history. But like, do you think without a religious worldview, something that you can't sustain scientifically, like for us to postulate, for example, you could say, look, human beings have intrinsic value in and of themselves. That's a philosophical statement. You can't validate it, or I would even say invalidate it through the scientific method because it's fundamentally materialist. I wonder how the materialist, that is to say the completely atheistic materialist, we live, we die. So Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, those sorts of thinkers. Do you think we can sustain a democracy without some sort of religious value at the core of it?
I think it's critical that religious value and secular values, that is, values that completely reject any form of religion, should be allowed to exist side by side. The fact is that there are a significant number of people, whether they're of the Christian Judeo background, whether they're Muslims, whether they're any other form of non-Christian religion, have an absolute entitlement to practice their religion, so long as it is practiced in a way that allows other people to follow their views, whether their own religious views or their own totally non-religious views. Do I think that as a society we need to have a Judeo-Christian base in order to function as a democracy? No, we don't. But I equally say to those people who rubbish religion, a person is entitled to believe in whatever they believe in. They're entitled to believe in whatever God they believe in. They're entitled to believe in no God. And I think mostly in Australia, we get it right. Where are the places that have got it wrong? Well, with the Christian religion, Northern Ireland is the best example.
Oh, yeah.
Catholics and Protestants believe in the same God, but particularly during the 30 years of the Troubles, 3,000 people killed and numerous people injured in fights between two brands of the one Christian religion. Similarly, in various places of the world, the Muslim religion is split between Sunnis and Shias, so long as it is in this country made clear that you work out your religious differences by legitimate, if necessary, forceful argument, but not by violence, then religion has a proper place in society.
Absolutely. I agree with most of that. I think the balance between, and it's kind of, see, my reasoning is this: it's actually a Judeo-Christian value to make the separation between church and state. And when you kind of like look at anywhere outside of Christendom, really, that separation never has been made. And so that's why you have these theocracies who are incredibly inflexible and incredibly kind of like, you don't want to live there. And the other values that, are deeply, again, not just Judeo-Christian. It's important to give, Greek thought, it's Jew here, it's Jew as well. But the ideas of the sovereign individual and stuff like that, like, they're Western ideas. And they don't seem to work all that well when we export them to other cultures. And that's why I'm really starting to think that these values that we take for granted, I think we can have a secular society, which is what the founding fathers of the United States envisioned, what I would suggest the founding fathers of Australia envisioned as well, giving to Caesar what is Caesar and giving to God what is God's. But still at the core of that, that's still a Judeo-Christian argument. Do you kind of see the circular reasoning behind it?
I do, and I don't think the reason is circular. I think a place like Iran, that is run by one brand of religion, and anyone who opposes it is in trouble, is as unattractive to live as a place like China, which is run by an autocratic regime that believes in a Chinese version of communism and controls all brands of religion. I think if you look at China on the one hand and Iran on the other, you see two extremes of utterly unattractive forms of government where the citizens are not allowed their individual freedom. I think in Australia, we've mostly got it right. We've mostly kept the separation of church and state apart. We have mostly tolerance of one religion and another. I think sometimes we can do better. The upcoming so-called Religious Freedoms Bill that's been sitting in the federal parliament now for 18 months unactioned, that's going to bring that debate forward again, because it gets down to things as basic as this. There was once a time when if you were a teacher in a Catholic school, that is a non-religious teacher, a lay teacher, and you got divorced, you were kicked out.
Yeah.
Or there was once a time where if you were a teacher and you were living with someone and not married to them, you got tossed out. I don't think any reasonable person wants to see that return to Australian public life. But some of the people who are pushing a particularly hard line view of the Religious Freedoms Bill that has been buried for 12 months by COVID have a very intolerant view of religion other than their own. And I would hate to see that bill enacted, which would enable intolerance. I think we've mostly got it right, but we can easily go down the wrong track.
Quite right. Quite right. I'm sorry to ask this, and you can exercise your right to silence, Terry, like if you don't want to answer this question. But look, everyone believes that Black Lives Matter. And oh, by the way, and I'm going to digress really quickly. We're getting a fair bit of love on Facebook here, and disproportionately, people are coppers, ex-coppers, pro-police, pilots who flew coppers around. And mate, you're getting a lot of respect here, Terry. I've got to say, like, the great interviewee, really enjoying hearing from this man. So, mate, the coppers are loving this. It's kind of, you wouldn't think it, but there it is. Look,
I say about coppers as I say about lawyers. If you regard coppers as all the same, regard lawyers as all the same, then that shows an inherent intolerance. There are a lot of good coppers I've struck in the 44 years I've been doing criminal defence. There are a lot of bad coppers I've struck. There are some unattractive criminal lawyers around. No group has a mortgage on being okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Good and evil goes down the heart, down the heart of all men. It's not this group or that group. But look, everyone believes that Black Lives Matter. But what do you think of the organisation? I'd be really interested in your take as a civil libertarian.
I think Black Lives Matter has grown out of what is clearly some demonstrated excesses, serious excesses of force, particularly in the US. But it's also had some traction in Australia and some traction in the UK, because there is still a view that there are a minority of police in each of those three countries who use excessive force, who are not held accountable for it. And while that view exists, then you're going to have protests against the police. I'm not an expert in Black Lives Matter, but I think Black Lives Matter in the US is simply another form of the sort of protests you've seen by Aboriginal groups in Australia for decades, when various Aboriginal groups say, and again, not all police, when they say police are not always brought to account for using excessive force. That's why we say body-worn cameras, all those sorts of things are absolutely necessary. Necessary for the police because it makes it hard for people to make false complaints, necessary for complainants. But Black Lives Matters in this country and overseas is simply a protest that has grown up against excessive force. You only had to look at that 8-minute video to say, is it any surprise? Is it any surprise after Floyd was killed that there was a huge reaction against that sort of violence? I think most police in the US would have been appalled by it. The fact is that most police, in my experience, do the right thing, including in difficult situations, but it gives protest groups greater fuel for the fire when police who do use excessive force and who are not properly brought to account just simply get away with it. It's a long-standing problem in this country, in the UK and in the US. But I again say, most police do the right thing. But as with any group, be it criminal lawyers or police, it's the minority that causes the problem, and it's the minority that causes the negative public image.
I agree with most of that, but I think where you and I disagree on is this. And first of all, I've actually been on a number of police websites and stuff like that, and yeah, I can validate that I have not seen one comment from any of these police Facebook sites or anything validating what happened. Not even a, well, you got to understand, 8 minutes is what it takes. So I have not seen any of that. And appalled would be a pretty accurate adjective. And I understand the protest movements, and like I'm an old classical liberal. I think protests, free speech of these things are really, really important. The actual organisation itself are kind of Marxist, and I loathe Marxism. I absolutely loathe Marxism without going into precise details here. And I'm kind of concerned that, you know, really well-meaning people might have been kind of sucked up into a movement without understanding what the organisation, again, making a distinction between the organisation and the movement, that the organisation and the movement are not one and the same. And I think the best way of articulating that would be, like here in Australia, as you know, 432 has been the number since 1991. And I don't have the stats right here on me. I should have had them. I should have had them ready. But about 10 of those deaths since 1991, so have been as a result of what you could call police action. So someone being shot, someone being headlocked, someone being hit and died, someone, you know, something like that. Chris Hurley, you know, falling on that, you know, chap in Palm Island, something like that. So that's 10 lives over those years. Now, awful, but lawful, all of them, you know, because the police haven't been. And if you disagree, I mean, that's fine. You may know of some cases. You go, well, maybe this guy should have been convicted. I don't know. Like, I don't know all of those cases well enough. I'm not willing to do that. But when you compare that to the statistics of murder and death and rape and stuff like that, it's literally 100-fold. Like, I wish I had the stats right here, right on me, and I'll put them in the comments bar afterwards. The point I'm trying to make is this: if Black lives really, really mattered to a lot of those protesters, and the magnificent Anthony Dillon says this, Jacinta Price says this, you got to understand that white people in blue shirts are not the threat to Black lives.
I agree with that. The fact, though, is to address your central question of Black Lives Matter's movement in the US concerns you because it's got a Marxist influence. Well, let's assume you're right. That doesn't mean to say that the Marxist influence runs Black Lives Matters. I recall during the street march ban in Queensland in 1977, when Joh Bjelke-Petersen brought in a law that said you couldn't have a street protest against his government unless you got a police permit, and you never got a police permit. One afternoon in October 1977, 400 people were arrested, not for assaulting police, but for marching around the street because they couldn't march. In that instance, Joh Bjelke-Petersen justified the march ban because he said those that were organising the marches were communists. There might have been a handful of communists, but the people I represented, particularly that afternoon in October 77, when 400 of them got arrested, were ordinary people from the suburbs who just simply said, we've had enough that this government has brought in a law that says we can't protest against the government. Even assuming there is some Marxism in Black Lives Matters, the fact is